welcome to episode number 5, the velocity stroke. The velocity stroke was first popularized by George Stone in the early 1900s, and then it was brought to drum corps by Tom Hannum with the Garfield Cadets in the late 80s and the Star of Indiana in the early 90s. We'll go into some more detail about the stroke in a second, but in general it revolves around the concept that changing your height doesn't necessarily change your volume. For example, I can play a really loud volume from a 6-inch height if I put a lot of speed into the bar. Now if I raise my mallet higher, I can actually play softer provided I'm not going as fast. And this is basically what the velocity stroke is all about, because what really matters is your velocity, not necessarily your height. So let's talk about that for a second. Alright guys, to start off, let's clear up our definitions of speed, velocity, and acceleration. Speed is the distance you travel over time, like 5 miles per hour. Velocity is also distance over time, but technically it contains a directional component in physics and calculus. But for our discussion, we're kind of going to use them interchangeably. It's kind of the same thing. Now acceleration is velocity over time, and this is kind of hard for our brains to measure. So here's an example. If your velocity is 5, that means you gain 5 meters every second. However, if your acceleration is 5, that means you gain 5 meters per second every second. So basically, every second, if your velocity is 5, you go 5 meters. But if your acceleration is 5, every second your speed goes up by 5 meters per second. And this all ties into force. So I want to clarify what force is and what it isn't, because a lot of people, when they're talking about the velocity stroke, they kind of misuse it a little bit. Force is what is used to bring an object at rest into motion, or an object that's in motion to rest. For example, when we begin a mallet stroke, the mallet is at rest, and we need force to get it moving. However, right before that mallet hits the bar, we stop using acceleration. If we kept using acceleration, then it would start to produce a dead stroke, and most of the time we don't want to do that. So instead, we want to talk about how energy is transferred from the mallet to the bar. And for that, we need the kinetic energy equation, which is 1/2 mv squared. And that talks about how much energy an object has due to its motion, and that's a little bit different than the force equation. So let's take a deeper look at this thing. On page 22 in Method of Movement, Lee Stevens states that any change in mass is halved, while any change in velocity is squared. And that's not totally accurate to what's going on, because multiplication is commutative, which means that we can take that 1/2 and stick it anywhere we want. For example, it can go over there, or it can go over there, or if we really wanted to, we can make everything a fraction and then multiply them all together and get this equation. And I think this is my favorite iteration of this equation because it emphasizes the fact that the 1/2 really isn't that important. Now, don't get me wrong, Lee Stevens is a total genius, and he totally understood the most important concept here, which is that velocity is squared and mass is not, and that has a drastic effect on the total energy. Here's an example. We're going to keep this really simple, no units or anything, we're just going to deal with the numbers. If your mass is 4 and your velocity is 4, then your total energy is going to be 32. Now if we take that mass and double it, then our total energy is going to be 64. So in essence, when we double the mass, we double the energy. Now instead, if we doubled the velocity, that changes our energy to 128. So doubling the velocity quadrupled our energy. Here's another example. If we triple the mass, our energy shoots up to 96. So in essence, tripling the mass tripled our energy. Now instead, if we triple the velocity, then that shoots the energy way up to 288. So tripling the velocity increased our energy by 9 times. So basically, changes on the mass have a linear effect on the total energy, but changes in velocity have an exponential effect on the total energy. This explains how people who aren't that big can break boards in karate and other martial arts, because they use such fast, high-speed strokes. They have an enormous amount of kinetic energy, and it snaps the board in half. Now, where our schools of thought on this really differ is when we're talking about drum corps style versus concert style. For example, in drum corps, you almost always play with a max velocity stroke. Like no matter what height you're playing at, you're going the maximum velocity that you possibly can. And in that environment, it presents a lot of advantages. For example, number one, playing at max velocity all the time ensures that you're going to have a big, robust sound. And when you're playing in front of lots and lots of people in a huge open stadium, that's what you want. You want to project your sound to the audience. Number two, typically in drum corps, you're playing with a lot of people in the front ensemble, and they're all playing the same passage. Now, if we're not all using the same velocity, I could play my mezzo forte at 6 inches, and the guy next to me could probably do it at 3 if he used a higher velocity. And if we really worked at it, we can get that to sound the same. But the problem is, it's going to look different. And if you're the judge in front of the ensemble, and you have 100 blaring horns in your face, and the drum line's pounding away, and you see this going on between two different people, you're not really going to be able to hone in and really tell, hey, are they playing the same, or is it different? You're just going to know that it looks different, so it's probably, it probably sounds different. You're going to mark it off and then move on. And number three, another advantage that this has is that if you always play with the maximum velocity, then the speed of your notes doesn't affect your volume to a point. Here's what I mean. Now, if you're playing with a technique that's called the constant motion technique, that means no matter how fast you're playing, your mallets are pretty much always going to be moving. For example, if you're playing some nice slow eighth notes, it looks something like this. Now, the problem with this technique is that as you get faster, if you want to maintain the same stick height, your mallet heads are going to go faster and faster and faster, and that's going to make your volume go higher and higher and higher. Looks something like this. So as you notice there, if you want to keep the mallet constantly moving, then the faster you're playing, the faster the mallet head is traveling, and the volume, especially the faster speeds, really starts to creep up and get higher. Now, if you're playing with a velocity stroke, then at the slow speed, you're going to play at the maximum velocity that you can. So when you get faster, there's not really going to be as much of a volume difference. For example, now, in the marching world, this is important because if I'm supposed to be playing at 6 inches and the guy next to me is supposed to be playing at 6 inches, but I'm playing eighth notes and he's playing 16th notes, if I'm using a constant motion technique, mine are automatically going to be softer than his. For example, I'll be over here doing this, and he'll be over there doing this. Okay, so it's about the same stick height, but because he's playing faster, that just really increases the energy that's going into his bar. So to compensate, if I want to sound equal to him, I'll have to go maximum velocity while I'm playing the eighth notes. Instead of this.